The discovery. The discovery of Zachary Harlan's body came as a shock to the local community, though no one could have anticipated the depths of darkness that would soon unfold. It was a cold December morning when the body of a small boy, no older than 4, was found floating face down in the bay under the Lint SLA bridge. The passerby who made the grim discovery called it in immediately, assuming it was a tragic accident. The boy had been missing for a few days, and the local news had already broadcast a public appeal for any information that could lead to his whereabouts. Police arrived at the scene quickly, securing the area and beginning their search of the waters. What they initially assumed was a drowning quickly turned into something more disturbing. Divers scoured the waters for hours, searching for more clues, when they made a chilling discovery: a small, lifeless body of a girl, her blonde hair still visible beneath the surface, weighted down by a pillowcase filled with rocks tied around her ankles. The young girl, later identified as 2-year-old Sadie Harlan, was found just a few yards from her brother's body, with her legs tightly bound. The weight of the rocks had kept her body submerged, and it was clear that she had been placed in the water after she had died. The horror of the scene left even the most seasoned investigators shaken. A sketch of the young boy was quickly produced and shared across the media. His babysitter, who had cared for the Harlan children on occasion, immediately recognized him as Zachary. She had been one of the last to see him alive just a few days earlier. She recalled that Zachary and Sadie had been playing in the backyard while their mother, Mary, prepared lunch inside. The babysitter had noticed nothing unusual that day, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The authorities were left with an unbearable mystery. Who could have done such a thing? The children's mother, Mary, was immediately questioned, but there were no signs of her involvement in their deaths. The investigators had yet to realize the full extent of the tragedy that had unfolded in the Harlan home. As the search for clues continued, a chilling detail emerged. The pillowcase tied to Sadie's ankles was not the only item found in the water. A second pillowcase, also weighed down with rocks, had been discovered near Zachary's body. This piece of evidence suggested that both children had been intentionally disposed of in the same manner, making it clear that the deaths of Zachary and Sadie were no accident. They were murder victims, carefully planned and executed. The authorities' suspicions quickly turned to the father, Christian Harlan. He had been absent during the discovery of his children's bodies, and the search for him intensified. Neighbors and friends recalled that Christian had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the disappearance. He had become distant, even withdrawn, and there were rumors that his relationship with Mary had been deteriorating for months. Christian's growing debt and financial troubles had taken a toll on their marriage, and friends claimed that Mary had confided in them about Christian's behavior. She suspected that he had been hiding something from her. The local police, unable to find Christian at the Harlan home, began searching the area. They scoured nearby woods, docks, and even checked local motels, but there was no sign of him. A quick search of his car led to nothing, but it did reveal a few items that seemed oddly out of place: a small suitcase, some personal belongings, and a set of keys that did not appear to belong to the Harlan family home. It was clear that Christian had been preparing to leave, or had already left. The investigation took another dark turn when the police discovered a hidden stash of documents in the Harlan home. These documents painted a picture of Christian's financial and emotional collapse. Credit card statements, pawn shop receipts, and bank records revealed an increasingly desperate man who had been juggling stolen identities, fraudulent checks, and an overwhelming amount of debt. It became clear that Christian's life was unraveling in ways that his family had never known. The authorities then discovered that the Harlan family had been living in squalor. Their home had been in a constant state of disrepair, and the couple had been moving frequently to avoid creditors. Christian had promised his wife that things would improve, but as time went on, it became evident that his promises were empty. The final blow came when Mary had found evidence of an affair between Christian and another woman, leading to a confrontation that further fractured their already strained relationship. But even with all the mounting evidence against him, Christian remained elusive. Days passed, and he was nowhere to be found. As the investigation deepened, the police feared that Christian might have fled the country, and their worst fears were confirmed when they learned that he had used a stolen credit card to fund a flight to Cancun, Mexico. Authorities quickly placed Christian Harland on the FBI's most wanted list, launching a nationwide search for the man who had seemingly vanished without a trace. In the meantime, the community was left to grapple with the haunting loss of two innocent children. Memorial services were held for Zachary and Sadie, with friends and family mourning the senseless violence that had taken their lives. The tragedy weighed heavily on everyone who had known the Harland family, and the unanswered questions about what had happened to Mary and baby Madison only deepened the sense of grief and shock. As the investigation continued to unfold, it became clear that Christian Harland was not the man he had once appeared to be. Behind the facade of a loving father and devoted husband, there lay a man capable of unimaginable cruelty. The hunt for him was far from over, and the authorities were determined to bring him to justice, no matter where in the world he might be hiding. In Cancun, however, Christian was living a carefree life, mingling with tourists, and even taking up the persona of a foreign journalist. He would later admit that he had assumed the identity of someone he had admired from a distance, a writer whose career had ended in disgrace. Christian had taken to impersonating this journalist, using his connections to continue evading the authorities. But his time in Mexico would be short-lived. Just as the FBI was closing in on him, a tourist recognized Christian from a photograph on a wanted poster. When the police arrived at his beach camp, Christian didn't put up a fight. He was arrested without incident, his life as a fugitive finally coming to an end. But for the families of Zachary, Sadie, Mary, and baby Madison, the long road to justice had only just begun. Early life and family struggles continued. Christian Harland's early years were marked by a combination of rigid discipline and a sense of spiritual purpose instilled by his devout Jehovah's Witness parents. Born into a tight-knit religious community, he was taught from an early age the values of responsibility, moral conduct, and community service. However, his upbringing was not without its challenges. Though he thrived in his faith, Christian's social life remained minimal. His parents encouraged a focused life, one devoted to ministry and worship. They had high expectations, and Christian, eager to please, worked hard to uphold the family's reputation within the congregation. He was known as a diligent young man, but by his late teens, he began to show signs of restlessness. Christian harbored an ambition that didn't seem to align with the humble lifestyle his parents had envisioned for him. His desire to experience the world beyond the walls of the church grew stronger, yet he also felt an overwhelming pressure to fulfill the duties expected of him. This created a tension within him, a longing for something more exciting, more daring, something that could give him the freedom he craved. At 18, Christian met Mary Jane, a vibrant 25-year-old woman who shared his faith but had a much more worldly, independent spirit. Mary Jane had grown up in Michigan, and though her background was similar in many ways to Christian's, she had already broken away from some of the more conservative aspects of her upbringing. She worked as a secretary for a prominent university, where she had made a name for herself as someone reliable and efficient, yet also unafraid to embrace life outside the confines of her religious upbringing. Their meeting was serendipitous. Christian, new to the congregation, noticed her at a church event. Mary Jane was different from any woman he had ever met, confident, assured, and articulate. They quickly found common ground, and their relationship evolved faster than either of them had anticipated. For Christian, Mary Jane represented the freedom he had yearned for, the chance to step outside the world of strict doctrines and live a life that felt more vibrant. For Mary Jane, Christian's earnestness and charm made him seem like the perfect man, someone whose dedication to faith and family would support her ambitions and bring stability to her life. However, things took a turn when Christian's parents learned of their relationship. His mother and father, both staunch in their beliefs, strongly opposed the match. Mary Jane, while devout, was seen as too independent and too old for Christian in their eyes. They saw her as a distraction from their son's path, a path that included a deeper commitment to their faith and the church. Christian found himself at a crossroads. His love for Mary Jane was undeniable, but his loyalty to his parents and the church was equally strong. The situation came to a head when, after a series of tense family discussions, his parents gave him an ultimatum: choose Mary Jane, or stay under their roof and continue living a life controlled by their expectations. Christian chose Mary Jane, and within weeks, he moved out of his parents' home, beginning an independent life with her. This decision was one that would define the rest of his life, though not in the way he had imagined. Moving in with Mary Jane, who was now his fiancée, was a fresh start for Christian. However, the financial strain soon became apparent. Christian, despite his youthful ambition, had not yet developed the practical skills to navigate the real world. Though he was hardworking, he struggled to find stable employment. Mary Jane, working as a secretary, did her best to hold things together. But their finances began to fray at the edges. In a desperate attempt to keep up appearances, Christian bought Mary Jane a lavish engagement ring that he couldn't afford. He put it on a payment plan but soon found himself unable to meet the installments. This financial burden led Christian to make a choice that would haunt him for years. He stole $18 from the camera store where he worked, hoping to cover the cost of his mistakes. He didn't come clean when confronted, but the following morning, his conscience got the better of him. He left the stolen money on the store counter with a letter of resignation, a gesture that would cost him much more than his job. Christian's fall from grace was swift. His roommates, also Jehovah's Witnesses, reported his theft to the church elders, and soon Christian was sanctioned. His pride was wounded, and his reputation within the church community was tarnished. This public shaming, coupled with the financial strain he was already under, marked the beginning of a pattern of deceit and desperation that would become a constant in his life. Despite this, Mary Jane remained by his side. She understood his flaws and forgave his transgressions, but it was clear that their life together would not be the idyllic, peaceful existence either of them had once envisioned. Christian was desperate to make things right, but he was also caught in a web of lies and half-truths. He promised Mary Jane that he would change, but instead of working through their financial problems, he turned to more risky schemes. Over the years, Christian's obsession with material success grew. He developed a fascination with wealth, luxury cars, and the lifestyle that he thought he deserved. He dreamed of fame, of being admired and respected by others. He became fixated on the idea of a glamorous life, a far cry from the modest existence that he had once shared with Mary Jane. This obsession led him to commit even more serious crimes, including the creation of a fake identity and the theft of a van. He used this stolen vehicle to start a cleaning business, but like everything else in his life, the business failed. Yet he continued to lie to his friends and family, pretending that everything was fine. In addition to his growing financial troubles, his marriage to Mary Jane began to deteriorate. The couple's constant moves, the mounting debt, and the strain of their difficult circumstances weighed heavily on their relationship. In May of 2000, Mary Jane discovered emails between Christian and another woman. The content was enough to devastate her. She confronted him about the affair, and his response, a mixture of indifference and anger, crushed her. He told her that he didn't love her anymore, and that their marriage was no longer worth fighting for. Yet, despite everything, Mary Jane stayed. She was determined to make it work for the sake of their children, and despite the heartache, she believed that her family could somehow overcome the struggles that Christian had brought upon them. But the cracks in their marriage were deepening, and as time went on, it became clear that Christian's financial problems were not going to improve. In late 2000, Christian's criminal activity caught up with him when he was caught in a check fraud scheme. The charges landed him in court for the first time, and though he was guilty, he received a remarkably light sentence: 3 years of probation and community service. However, his relationship with the church was irreparably damaged, and he was officially disfellowshipped. Christian lost not only his family's support, but also his sense of community. Now truly isolated, Christian sank deeper into despair. His lies, his thefts, and his constant struggle to maintain the facade of success began to suffocate him. He resorted to even more extreme measures to cover his tracks, including opening a credit card in his father's name and running up nearly $100,000 in debt. As the financial pressure mounted, he and Mary Jane moved several times, each time trying to escape from creditors, but never escaping the growing tension within their home. The final straw came when the Harlans moved to Oregon, a place they had hoped would be a fresh start. They swindled their way into yet another rental, this time a bayfront condo. But even here, things did not improve. Christian's part-time job at Starbucks was humiliating to him, and the financial pressure only intensified. The family struggled to pay bills, often relying on the meager earnings from Christian's part-time work. As Christmas 2001 approached, Christian looked out from the condo's balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was in that moment, as he thought about his mounting debts, his fractured marriage, and the pressure of supporting his family, that the thought crossed his mind. This had to end. He knew he couldn't continue living this way. But instead of seeking help or facing the consequences of his actions, Christian Harlan made a decision that would seal his fate and change the lives of his family forever. He knew that, to escape, he would need to eliminate the very people he had promised to protect: his wife and children. The unraveling. Christian Harlan's decision to end the suffering he felt trapped in was as calculated as it was chilling. With every passing day, his debt mounted, his lies compounded, and the pressure to maintain a facade of success grew unbearable. As Christmas 2001 approached, Christian stood at a precipice, his mind no longer teetering on the edge of desperation, but now firmly fixed on the path to murder. The Harlan family's existence had become a far cry from the idyllic life Christian had once imagined for them. The small bayfront condo they had secured was nothing more than a temporary hiding place, a last-ditch effort to flee their creditors, but also a reflection of how far they had fallen. Christian spent his days working at the Starbucks inside a local Fred Meyer, serving coffee to people far wealthier and more successful than he felt he could ever be. He was humiliated, but the job provided a small income, and that was enough to keep up appearances. Mary Jane, despite her ongoing suspicions, continued to believe that things could improve. She was determined to make their family work, for the sake of their children, Zachary, Sadie, and the youngest, baby Madison. Christian told her stories about potential business ventures, about grand plans to turn their lives around. Yet the cracks in their relationship were impossible to ignore. The lack of trust, the ongoing financial strain, and the undeniable tension in the air were all starting to suffocate her. Then, in early December, Christian found a moment of clarity amidst the chaos. One night, as he sat alone in the condo, he reflected on everything that had gone wrong. The stolen van, the check fraud, the failed business ventures, the lies about his income. He thought about how his children, Zachary, Sadie, and little Madison, had been caught in the fallout of his lies. Mary Jane, too, had suffered, unable to keep up the illusion of stability. The burden was too much for him to carry anymore. At that moment, Christian realized that there was only one way to end the pressure, only one way to escape the suffocating grip of his own failures. He needed to make them disappear. His mind raced with the thought, and a dark plan began to form. For days, Christian kept his thoughts to himself, watching his family as they carried on with their routines. He observed Mary Jane as she prepared breakfast for the children, Zachary running through the living room with his toys, Sadie laughing in the corner, and little Madison gurgling happily in her crib. It all seemed so perfect, so innocent, and that only made his internal conflict worse. Yet the weight of his actions grew heavier with every passing day. As Christmas Day came closer, Christian's plan began to take shape. He would do this while Mary Jane and the children were still asleep. The thought of confronting his wife and children in this manner seemed surreal, but Christian was already beyond the point of turning back. He felt as though he was drowning in a sea of guilt, stress, and lies, and the only lifeline he could see was this unspeakable act. On December 17th, he pretended everything was normal. He kissed his children goodbye that morning as he left for work, making sure to act as though there was nothing unusual about the day. But inside, his mind was already set on what was to come. When Mary Jane picked him up from work later that day, there was something different about her, something he hadn't expected. She wasn't angry or accusatory, but there was a sorrow in her eyes, a depth of sadness that spoke volumes. Christian couldn't shake the feeling that Mary Jane knew something was wrong. She had been silent during the drive home, and the eerie quietness in the car made Christian's heart race. When they arrived at the condo, things took an unexpected turn. Mary Jane didn't immediately go inside. Instead, she stood outside, barefoot, and dressed only in her bathrobe, her eyes distant. Christian followed her into the living room, his heart pounding, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his chest. The house was eerily quiet, but then he heard it, a faint cry from baby Madison's room. Mary Jane, still standing in the doorway, said nothing. She simply looked at him, her eyes full of sorrow. "What's wrong?" Christian asked, his voice shaky, though he had planned this moment with cold precision. Mary Jane didn't answer immediately. She stepped past him and into Madison's room, where the baby lay on the bed. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. Mary Jane's eyes welled up with tears, but Christian could see the rage and betrayal bubbling beneath the surface. "I know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know what you've been doing. I know what you've become. And I'm done." Christian froze. Her words sent a shiver down his spine, and for the first time in months, he felt truly vulnerable. Her anger, her pain, was too much to bear. She slapped him across the face, hard, and Christian stumbled back, the sting of the blow cutting through the numbness that had consumed him. He had prepared himself for everything, except this. Mary Jane was trembling now, her voice rising with each word. "I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending we're fine when you've lied to me every day. The kids, they deserve better." Christian, suddenly desperate, stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice weak. "I'll change, I swear, Mary Jane. I promise. Just give me a chance." But Mary Jane was done. She turned away from him, not looking back as she walked toward the door. "You don't get to make promises anymore," she said, her voice cold. "Not after everything." Christian's heart raced as he watched her leave the room. He felt a surge of rage, anger that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. But it wasn't just rage, it was fear. Fear that his world was collapsing around him, and there was no way out. In a blind, uncontrollable rage, Christian turned toward the crib where baby Madison lay. He couldn't think. He couldn't reason. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, the rushing blood in his ears. He grabbed the nearest pillow from the couch, his hands shaking, and stuffed it over his daughter's face, pressing down hard. She fought, but her tiny body was no match for his desperation. When she stopped moving, Christian stood over her, panting heavily, the realization of what he had done slowly sinking in. But it wasn't over. He turned toward Mary Jane. His hands were trembling, but there was no going back now. With an eerie calm, Christian walked toward her. She was standing in the kitchen, looking out the window, unaware of his approach. He reached for her, his hands closing around her throat. Mary Jane's eyes widened in shock as he squeezed, his grip tightening. "I can't let you leave," he muttered under his breath. Mary Jane struggled, gasping for air, but Christian's grip only tightened. She fought valiantly, but in the end, she was no match for his strength. Within minutes, she was lifeless in his arms. Now, with his wife and child dead, Christian's mind seemed to clear. But there was one last piece to his twisted plan. He dragged their bodies into separate suitcases, using heavy rocks to weigh them down, just as he had seen in movies. The weight of the bodies would ensure they sank, hidden beneath the water's surface. He was determined that this would be the last time anyone would ever find out what he had done. As he drove away, Christian thought to himself that he had finally found the escape he had longed for. The pressure was gone. The life he had built with Mary Jane and the children was over. And in its place, he would become a new man. The man he always dreamed of being. The escape. Christian Harlan's world had crumbled before his eyes, and now, with the deaths of his wife, Mary Jane, and their youngest daughter, Madison, he was determined to ensure that his carefully executed plan would remain undetected. As the hours passed in that cold December night, a twisted sense of calm washed over him. In his mind, the suffocating weight of his debts, his lies, and his failing family had all been lifted in an instant. The family he had been burdened with was now gone, and he was free to start anew, free to reinvent himself in a way that he had longed for all his life. Christian carefully packed the bodies of his wife and daughter into suitcases, the rocks he had tied around them ensuring they would sink to the bottom of the bay once discarded. He knew he had to act quickly. The more time that passed, the greater the risk of someone finding out. He loaded the heavy suitcases into the back of his van and drove out of the condo parking lot, not once looking back. The path ahead of him was clear in his mind. He would get rid of the evidence, then disappear. With no one to stop him, Christian drove aimlessly for hours, allowing the distance between him and the place where he had murdered his family to grow. His mind churned with the next steps in his carefully planned escape. He knew he had to leave Oregon quickly. Staying in the area would only increase the likelihood that someone would find out what he had done. He couldn't take any chances. The plan, after all, was not just to rid himself of his family, but to create a new life, one where no one would ever find him again. Christian had a history of fleeing. In the past, he had abandoned jobs, friends, and even family members when things went wrong. His history of deception had made him an expert in covering his tracks, and now he relied on those skills to stay ahead of the authorities. He wasn't the first man to flee after committing such unspeakable crimes, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. But Christian believed he could outsmart them. He had done it before, and now he would do it again. The night he killed his wife and children, Christian didn't head straight to the docks where he intended to dispose of the bodies. Instead, he took a roundabout route, trying to throw off anyone who might be paying attention. He drove in circles, stopping at empty parking lots and turning down dark side streets, ensuring he wasn't followed. The last thing he needed was for the police to track his movements. He couldn't afford any mistakes now. By the time he arrived at the docks, the early morning fog had settled over the water, obscuring the view of the surrounding area. Christian parked his van near an isolated dock, far from any lights or prying eyes. He unloaded the suitcases from the van and carried them to the edge of the pier. His heart was pounding as he struggled with the weight of the bodies, but he remained focused. He wasn't afraid of being caught, not yet, at least. At that moment, he felt a strange sense of power, like he was in complete control. He lifted the suitcases and heaved them into the water, one by one, watching as they sank below the surface. Once the bodies were gone, Christian sat in the darkness for a moment, staring out at the water. His thoughts were fleeting, disjointed, full of exhilaration and disbelief. It wasn't until he saw the faint outline of his reflection in the water that he realized what he had just done. He had murdered the very people he had once promised to protect. The shock of it hit him like a wave, but he quickly pushed it down. There was no time for regret now. Christian drove back to the condo, trying to steady his breathing, forcing himself to remain calm. It was late, but he had no intention of returning to the apartment to face anyone. He couldn't bear the thought of staying there with the bodies still fresh in his mind. He had already begun to think about his escape, and he knew it needed to happen fast. He thought about leaving for Mexico, a place where no one would recognize him. He had been there before on a fleeting vacation, and it had seemed like the perfect place to disappear. It was far from the authorities' reach, and Christian had heard rumors about people starting fresh there, new identities, new lives. He could blend in with the tourists, live anonymously. He imagined himself sipping cocktails on a beach, far from the consequences of his actions. The dream was enticing, and he knew it was his best chance for freedom. The next day, Christian made his move. He didn't tell anyone where he was going or what he was doing. The people at the Starbucks where he worked were accustomed to his erratic behavior, so no one would notice if he just disappeared. His coworkers were too caught up in their own lives to pay much attention to his. Christian took advantage of this indifference, walking out the door of the coffee shop for the last time. He didn't turn back. Once he was out of town, Christian used the stolen credit card information he had swiped from a customer months earlier to fund his escape. With a fake identity in hand, he booked a one-way ticket to Cancun, Mexico. No one knew he was leaving, and no one could stop him. He felt like a new man, ready to reinvent himself far from the wreckage he had left behind. Arriving in Cancun, Christian immersed himself in the carefree lifestyle of a tourist. He rented a small bungalow on the beach and spent his days enjoying the warm sun, meeting new people, and pretending to be someone else. His charm and confidence made it easy for him to slip into the role of a jet-set traveler, someone with connections, someone important. He had become the person he always wanted to be, with no one questioning his past. In Cancun, Christian used a variety of aliases, including one based on a journalist he had long admired. Michael Flo, a man whose career had been marred by scandal. Christian read articles by Flo and, fascinated by the writer's audacity and ability to manipulate public perception, decided to take on his identity. He passed himself off as Flo, knowing that it would be difficult for anyone to track him down with a new name and a carefully constructed persona. Christian blended in with the foreign tourists, drinking at local bars and dancing with young women. He had finally embraced the life he had always dreamed of, and for the first time in years, he felt free. The weight of his past, of the lives he had destroyed, seemed distant, but deep down, Christian knew that his freedom was fragile. He couldn't remain hidden forever, but for the time being, it didn't matter. He was living his dream. But freedom, as Christian would soon learn, was fleeting. Word of his crimes soon began to spread, and authorities began to close in. His time in paradise was coming to an end, and it would only be a matter of time before the truth caught up with him.